Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Dissenter Update. How is everybody doing? It's good to be back with you for this show, the latest edition of the Dissenter Update. I'm Kevin Gosztola, the editor of the Dissenter newsletter. This podcast is a part of covering whistleblowers, press freedom, and government secrecy. Thank you for being here. If you're getting this on September 15th, thank you for being a paid subscriber. And let me check in with those of you who do listen and watch this regularly. How is everybody? Everything seems to be coming apart around us. We're seeing events continue to unfold that should shock anyone. And yet, some of us still are managing to keep it together. I've seen some incredibly amazing people out there doing community defense work. I've seen people who are doing the writing, they're doing reporting, they're going out there to the scenes of some of the most horrifying incidents you could imagine, and they're bearing witness and they're standing up to this violence. They are standing up for rights and principles and values that we all should hold dear. And those are the people that I want to celebrate and elevate on this podcast on a regular basis. I want to have some more people like that on this show. Media solidarity, support for the hardworking journalists and writers who are out there every day trying to salvage what is left of this institution that we call the press, uh, that has been corporatized, that is monopolized by those who are profit hungry, those who are merely out to serve Trump. And before I get to my guest this week, Adam Rose, who is the Los Angeles Press Club press rights chair, someone I have followed, and I've been looking at his updates about Los Angeles for several months now. Let's first mention that CBS News is entirely transforming into a kind of state media organ, if not a state identified media outlet. It is one that we are seeing now. They plan to acquire the Free Press. They've planned to give Barry Weiss, the editor of that publication, a top role. And then we see that there is a bias monitor. This was imposed by Donald Trump's FCC censorship czar, Brendan Carr, who is going to take over, uh, who has taken over this role of enforcing this kind of discipline among different media organizations, particularly legacy media outlets, forcing them to publish and stay between a certain set of lines when it comes to coverage of Trump, or else face the threat of being sued by Donald Trump, face the threat of investigations. And some have been more willing than others to comply. Some of the executives have been thrilled to comply if only they can improve their bottom lines at the same time that they are being compliant with the US government. But we, see here in this article, one of my colleagues and somebody who's been a guest in on the show, Seth Stern, who is the advocacy director for Freedom of the Press Foundation. He wrote a column for The Guardian on this bias monitor that is working for Paramount. Paramount now merged with Skydance. The bias ombudsman that is going to be there, his name is Kenneth Weinstein, and he is a Republican partisan. He's a Trump bootlicker. He's somebody who is also advocated and pushed for CBS to no longer edit interviews. And that was a response to criticism from Kristi Noem, Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem. Noem is somebody we'll be getting to more in this week's show this latest show, because she is responsible for attacks on journalists in Los Angeles, and also making the climate more chilly for journalists throughout the United States. And so, yeah, this ombudsman who's going to be there, this bias monitor, is essentially going to be there policing what CBS News publishes and steering it in a direction that is more favorable to Trump. And I think part of making it fit into what the FCC wants would be to acquire the free press and then bring Barry Weiss on board. And so Barry Weiss, will become a tool of the Trump administration within the CBS news media organization that is already functioning like a propaganda machine more and more every day because of what Brendan Carr is imposing on it from within the FCC. Also, I'm in the middle of my own battle with some other people who are in a community in a West Chicago suburb called Elmwood Park. This is where I live. And it's actually not too far from the ICE detention center that has made national news over the last several weeks as President Donald Trump escalates and deploys hundreds of ICE agents, threatens to send in the National Guard, sends forces to a naval base up just actually a few miles north of the city of Chicago. And so I only mention it because if you think that the quality is somehow declining over the next several weeks, I apologize. I'll do everything I can to keep it up and maintain. I'm doing a pretty good job of getting out a couple articles a week if you're a subscriber, one every week if you're not a subscriber, staying on top of some of the bigger press freedom stories, looking for whistleblower stories that need to be told. But I am being pulled in to a kind of fight that demands my attention. And in fact, it has been highlighted by the US Press Freedom Tracker, a project of the Freedom of the Press Foundation. It's in that national database now. It's in that database for people to see and get an idea. It's the only incident in Illinois that has occurred in 2025, according to their database. It's, not saying that there haven't been violations of freedom of the press in Illinois, but it's the only one thus far this year that tracker has documented. And there's updates to share. There's a lot that I'm dealing with, juggling this while also doing this podcast and the dissenter, which I am happy to do. And also being a dad in just a couple of weeks, my daughter will turn 2 years old. And I hope that I can continue to do all of this, but I know that around 2 or 3, it can be pretty demanding. And so I'm prepared for wherever any of this goes. And I'm prepared to ask you if you do believe in what you're hearing and listening is something that is worthwhile to support. Please go to thedissenter.org, chip in a few bucks a month by being a paid subscriber. You get episodes early. You'll get them a couple days before everybody, and you'll make it possible for this journalism on press freedom, whistleblowers, and government secrecy. And you'll make it possible for me to keep bringing in guests like the one that I'm going to introduce to you now. This is Adam Rose, who is the press rights chair for the Los Angeles Press Club. Hello, everyone. I'm Kevin Gosztola, and welcome to this conversation for the Dissenter Update. I'm pleased to be joined by my guest, Adam Rose, who is a press rights chair for the Los Angeles Press Club. And in LA, they've been fighting the basically, almost all the police forces that are there in LA to respect freedom of the press. So, welcome to the show.
Hey, Kevin, thanks for having me on and talking about this today.
I actually have wanted to speak with you about the work that you do out there because I've noticed your, press freedom tracking in LA and thought it was commendable and you're doing very thorough work. But this is now a timely discussion and a timely opportunity for me to have you and hold this conversation because the courts out there have ruled in your favor. You are a plaintiff along with some others in two separate lawsuits involving the LAPD. Was the LA Sheriff's Department involved?
So there's actually three cases, but two rulings that just landed
Okay,
very, very recently here. So of those three cases, the Department of Homeland Security and Los Angeles
right.
Police Department are the rulings that we have succeeded on so far. The Sheriff's Department case will proceed soon. It's a little just further behind procedurally, but is extremely similar in fact pattern and law as the LAPD.
Okay, so what I was going to get to is that there was the DHS. So then you sued the DHS and DHS Secretary Kristi Noem, and we'll begin with that just because obviously this is the face of all these ICE operations, these raids. There's been a lot from coast to coast written about the rights violations that are going on in communities as a result of the way that ICE agents are conducting themselves, a lot of them with masks. But then we have other federal police forces that are mentioned as defendants in this lawsuit, which you're welcome to get into, who are implicated in this lawsuit. And so tell people about what the judge basically ruled. And I know that you were celebrating the outcome because it vindicated the fact that your rights deserve to be protected.
Very, yeah, very much so celebrating the latest news here, and there's a lot to unpack there. So I'm happy to do it. The different cases are because we have just different authorities here. In the LAPD case, it's really the city of Los Angeles that's being sued. LA Sheriff's Department, it's the county of Los Angeles. For people around the country, for a sense of size here, LAPD is like 8 to 9,000 officers, and the LA Sheriff's Department is the largest sheriff's department in the country with about 10,000 sworn personnel. So, we're talking about very large departments, but nothing's going to be larger than the Department of Homeland Security. And they have a huge alphabet soup of three-letter agencies. So we've got FPS, the Federal Protective Service. We've got obviously ICE that people are thinking about, CBP for Customs and Border Patrol. There's a handful of others almost not worth getting into. Even within those, there's other three-letter acronyms you may see for like HSIs, Homeland Security Investigations. Then they have Special Response Teams, SRTs. So it's a lot to try and navigate when you're just seeing all these letters thrown around. Easy just to call it DHS, Department of Homeland Security. And so, Kristi Noem's been sued in her official capacity here. But really, it's about the agents who are going out there and who are preventing journalists from doing their job. In this particular case, and this is what distinguishes it from the local ones, all three of these cases are to protect the rights of journalists, to cover the actions of law enforcement, to cover protests, to cover what's happening in our streets. The DHS case is a little bit further than that in terms of also protecting legal observers. And if anyone doesn't know, a legal observer tends to be a lawyer, a law student. It's not really a firm certification requirement, but they tend to go out with like neon green hats or bright blue vests, whether it's National Lawyers Guild or ACLU. So in addition to the press, it's also protecting them, and really interestingly also protects the protesters themselves. And that's something I was really glad to see, because one of the things that journalists go out and document and bear witness to are these violent assaults on protesters, which it shouldn't matter what someone's point of view is. It shouldn't matter what they're there to express. They should have the right to express that point of view. And so when they get attacked for that, and they're met with violence by the state, and by the state I mean federal, it is a real concern. And so having seen that, I'm heartened to be a part of this DHS case, which of the three is the only one that also expands protections to the legal observers and protesters who are out there. And none of these cases, to be clear, are trying to say, well, we have to. We're not trying to protect anyone who's actually committing a real crime, right? We're not protecting anyone who's throwing a brick, who's damaging property. We're just saying, look, if people are out there peacefully and they're observing and they're documenting, they shouldn't be targeted. They shouldn't be hit indiscriminately. And protesters as well. We hope to see that they're allowed to exercise their First Amendment rights. So with that as the context for all of this, you had to be living under a rock not to know that ICE has been doing these raids, that the federal government has been invading cities in many cases and in many capacities. We literally have had constitutional crises unfolding on our streets as the National Guard is deployed, and then the Marines here in Los Angeles. And we may see this whether it's Chicago or Nashville or anywhere else. And these are matters of extreme public importance and public interest. But let me tell you a little bit about Los Angeles. This is a huge place. It is kind of hard to wrap your mind around if you're not from here. This is, as a geography goes, I believe the largest county in California, but it's certainly larger by population than 40 states. Right? We have such a huge physical size here that when you think about urban sprawl, the first thing that comes to mind is Los Angeles. When these raids have been happening, when protests have been happening by the tens of thousands, most people had no idea in Los Angeles. We went about our daily lives. We went to the farmers market. We, went to the movies. We, were watching Netflix at home. Um, Most people wouldn't have known the extent, even when there's 10,000 people in the streets of downtown Los Angeles. One of the biggest days of these protests, you could go across town to West Hollywood, and the Pride Parade was that same day and probably had 10 times the number of people. So I mean, these protests can barely fill a moderate-sized soccer stadium. And yet we literally have a constitutional crisis in our streets with the Marines, the National Guard. So it's really critical that the press document that, because otherwise the public just wouldn't know what's going on. And what we saw, especially at the start of June, was over 100 incidents just in the greater Los Angeles area. And this is all in that tracker that you mentioned, where I just put together a spreadsheet and listed out every incident, supporting links to open source intelligence articles about the incidents. 100 incidents of police misconduct towards press. These range from things like kettling press, which is an act of keeping them away essentially from the action and making sure they can't observe, they don't have sight and sound access, to life-altering injuries, concussions, brain trauma. Someone was likely permanently blinded in one eye because of the violence. Hands gashed open, bruising, broken ribs. Really, horrifying levels of violence. And, in one case, there's someone who had a 3-inch shell casing had to be surgically extracted from his leg. He went out, in his first day back in the field, about a month or so later, after recovering from surgery and being in the hospital for several days. Literally, the first day out, he gets hit in the chin with a baton by a different department. Many people who are journalists out there just trying to document have experienced incident after incident. And these people range from people who are Pulitzer Prize winning photographers, on air reporters for major national TV networks, all the local newspapers and TV stations and radio stations, and really importantly, all of the freelancers and independent journalists. These are people who might be live streaming on YouTube or Twitch or Twitter or wherever else, or not Twitter, TikTok, and are informing the public. And what's critical as well in ensuring these protections apply to all journalists of all types is that, like, we know the media industry is financially in decline, and the journalists that I know at local traditional corporate MSM, whatever you want to call it, outlets, they're making their best effort, but they're not everywhere. And there's 24/7 protests happening in Los Angeles. Literally, there's a 24/7 protest encampment that keeps getting set up, and the police keep taking it down. It keeps getting set up. So that unto itself is a story. And a corporate newsroom can't afford to send people out over and over, but the freelancers, they're there, and the independents, they're there. And so they're the reason I know about this and can tell you about it right now. So it's so vital that we protect those journalists and their rights, and that when we've seen what's happened out there, that they've been so grievously injured, that it would chill someone of normal, composition from going out there and wanting to document it. It certainly scares the hell out of a lot of people, and they're bravely soldiering on, but they shouldn't have to be exposed to what they've been exposed to. So that's the scene. That's Los Angeles, and in many ways, I expect this will be the setting elsewhere throughout the country. And so, whether it's DHS because of ICE raids or and other related actions, whether it's the local police, either responding to those sorts of things or just dealing with things like the No Kings protests and things like that, which can likely recur, we're going to see it more and more often. So I'm excited to jump into what we actually got out of this in a legal sense in terms of these court cases. But let me pause there because I provided a lot of context, which I hope is helpful for the viewers and listeners out there. But I want to make sure that we've covered everything there that you wanted to tackle.
Well, thanks. I was struck by that phrase that was in Judge Hernan Vera's decision, that it was surprising savagery. I just thought that, like, that was a very blunt. Sometimes judges don't actually meet the level of brutality directly with the language that they use. It could be fairly sterile language that they address the use of force by police. But something that stood out for me, and in the report that was shared with people who subscribe to my newsletter, I highlighted the amount of documentation of people being targeted in the head. Maybe you have the specifics, maybe you don't, but I think it's rather stunning to think that, and you were saying somebody could be permanently blind in one eye. It seems
Yeah, I mean,
like,
they were hit 2 or
yeah,
3 months ago, and they still haven't recovered vision, and it's
yeah.
unlikely that, frankly.
So I just was going to say that, like, we've seen some of this as a recurring instance. Like, if we don't start the history with just the ice raids, but just go back to the extensive violations that happened when people were protesting, police violence related to George Floyd's murder by the Minneapolis police, and that was a I think that was a pivotal moment that was shaped that did shape a lot of how people understand freedom of the press for reporters covering protests. And then also, I think, it's good to hear you say that you're proud that the protesters are included in this decision with the DHS, because sometimes there is a little bit of tension, a little bit of animosity from those that are out there demonstrating. They look at reporters like myself, if I would be out there, any of my colleagues, people there in LA, and they say, "Well, you just think you have rights. You don't think that I have rights. Like, you just think like the police if the police were shooting at me, it would be okay. But when they shoot at you, like, it's a bigger story than if we get mistreated, because that's just what always happens at these protests. So it's just no big deal." But yeah, I was really struck by the documentation and the way that Vera brought out the savagery in the decision that was issued.
Yeah, well, again, a lot to unpack here. One of the first things I'll point out is that the goal of press rights is an informed public, and we don't have a functioning democracy without an informed public. So I had never ever have argued and never would argue that press rights are superior to the rights of others. But what I would argue rather forcefully is that all other rights depend on press rights. So the reason I focus the way I do personally is to say this is the foundation for everything else. So I'm going to fight for that first. But I respect and salute people who fight for all sorts of other rights. And I hope that whatever political persuasion someone may have, whatever viewpoint, that by having information, by having documentation, and by having an informed public to make decisions at the ballot box, that is what empowers you for whatever you might believe in. And so that's the fundamental truth that I try and fight for, is the ability for people to seek out that truth for themselves. So that's the first thing I really wanted to tackle out of that. But back to this idea of the savagery. The word that he used as a modifier was surprising. And when I posted that online, a lot of people reacted and said, "Well, I wasn't surprised. DHS and police are brutal." And there's certainly so much precedent and so much concern over that. But I think that when people are going about their daily lives, they're blissfully unaware of how bad it can get out there. And again, we think about scale and the huge just size of Los Angeles. So no wonder people here don't know. That to me is not surprising. They wouldn't know. So it's not surprising that they're surprised. I think for people who keenly follow this day to day, yeah, of course, they're not surprised. They've been seeing these images and having their stomach churning for years. And so, I am heartened to know that people who need to be surprised by this are surprised. The savagery is the scary part, and that is documented through so much evidence because these are journalists, and nowadays everyone's got a camera in their pocket on their phone. So because of all of this being out there, the judge at different points called it a mountain of evidence, an avalanche of evidence, and like a cavalcade of evidence. I mean, it was like he was busting out the thesaurus, because there was so much there from over 100 different incidents. 50 for one department, 30 from for another, 20 from another. It adds up, and the evidence shows. And this is one of those things where I'm talking about people losing their eye, but some of these images are just so gruesome. It's not the kind of thing you want to think about over, or if you're listening to this during a meal. This is very scary stuff. And I want to talk a little bit about that history too that you mentioned. And 2020 really awakened a lot of people. In Los Angeles, though, we were not surprised because, I think for many of us who are watching here, that was just, I mean, it's practically old hat at that point. And so I'm sadly relieved that people are at least waking up to all of this. In Los Angeles, there's just a few days ago was the 55th anniversary of the killing of Ruben Salazar, who is a famous journalist from Los Angeles history. He was the first Chicano columnist for the Los Angeles Times. He was the news director of a TV station. He was closely associated with Cesar Chavez in the labor rights movement. A great chronicler of peoples, of communities, of Los Angeles itself, and an icon in journalism. He went to go cover a anti-Vietnam War protest, and ducked into a bar to take a break with a friend, or with a coworker, and they're sitting inside a bar off the street, and the LA Sheriff's Department shot him with a tear gas canister and killed him. That was 55 years ago, almost to the day. That was, something that I think woke a lot of people up. For those familiar, Hunter S. Thompson wrote an amazing Rolling Stone piece about that, and that actually was the precursor to Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas. Right? These are actually based on real things, and so that was actually one of the instances that set off that novel and that movie, the plot line in it. So this is deeply part of our culture and history as Los Angeles, and in particular for journalists of color and people of color here. This is we've got Ruben Salazar Park and a lot of different things have been done to honor this individual. So that, if you want to go back historically, stands out to me. But with LAPD, I would say in particular, I trace this to the 2000 Democratic National Convention, which was here in downtown Los Angeles and led to settlements. I was in college in Los Angeles at the time, wound up a couple years later interning for a journalist who was actually one of the plaintiffs on the settlements. Very notable TV reporter on air here in town, very recognizable. He actually had a very big national TV show in the years just before that. So unmistakable guy. And so he was batoned by police, as were many journalists chased away. And I just vividly remember him telling me these stories, in the couple of years following, and how he came back hours later when he could finally get back to his briefcase. And this was in the age of of film photography. And so he had a very expensive camera, and he opens up the briefcase and he's like, ah, thank goodness my camera's here. And then he checks the film, and it was gone. No one else had access at that point because LAPD had chased everyone away. And he probably had photographs that would have implicated a lot of officers in violent attacks against innocent people. Um, there was a settlement. LAPD agreed to change their policies coming out of that. Fast forward to 2007, there was a labor rights protest called the May Day Melee. And the rioters, again, were not the individuals in the streets, the protesters, it was the cops who were rioting. And LAPD savagely beat up people who were, not only protesters, but journalists, career-ending injuries leading to millions in dollars of legal settlements, tens of millions of dollars in total. And LAPD still didn't learn its lesson. 2011, Occupy movement, which a lot of people I'm sure are still very familiar with. There was a journalist covering those protests, and LAPD. This was the first time LAPD really should have realized their dispersal orders. No one could hear them. They couldn't get the dispersal orders out. Calvin Millen was a journalist for City News Service, Big Wire here in LA. And so he walks up to a police line and he says, hey, I got to go file my story. And they wouldn't let him through. And he got into an argument. He was a little upset about it. But then afterwards, an LAPD spokesperson came out and said, well, he didn't have a credential and he was drunk. Oh, that's a hell of an accusation. Right after video comes out, he's wearing his credential from LAPD around his neck. He's holding it up to the LAPD officers. And he hadn't had a drink in 20 years. He was sober. So that's the history just in this town of these little shenanigans that LAPD plays. And then we hit 2020. Black Lives Matter movement. 2021, there was something we refer to as Echo Park, which was a homeless rights protest where dozens of journalists were beat up or arrested by LAPD. There's still settlements coming out of that in the hundreds of thousands of dollars. It seems like they're dropping all the time right about now, which is, as a taxpayer, I don't want that. It's never the officer held accountable. It's me and others in this city who are paying out of our own pockets for these damages. The officers get away scot-free. 2022, we had the Dobbs decision, which overturned Roe v. Wade, and there were abortion rights protests. And at that point, we had just gotten the state legislature to look at what LAPD had done and pass a law saying you cannot arrest or detain or interfere with journalists at protests. We got a law passed that said that. And LAPD then again rioted, and they beat up journalists left and right in the streets who were just trying to cover this abortion rights protest. There are still pending damages lawsuits over that. It's it's exhausting here. Even in, by the way, in 2023 Israel-Palestine protests,
Right.
yeah, there's a lot of protester violence. We've seen protester violence against journalists over the years in these different incidents. 2023 it was especially bad with protesters spraying journalists with tear gas and just unprovoked. LAP just stood there and watched. They didn't do anything. And
Mm.
it was, who are they protecting? Who are they serving? Right? That's their motto, to protect and to serve. And that includes the journalists, but they sure as heck weren't doing it. That's our history of Los Angeles. So you get to 2025 and this incredible, horrific series of incidents that the judge commented on about the savagery in the case of DHS and similar terminology in the case of LAPD. And his first line in that LAPD decision was, "It's deja vu all over again." And after hearing all of that, I think you can imagine why.
I would imagine if you were a judge that you would be looking at some of this and immediately have that inkling that, like, haven't I litigated this case already? Haven't I reviewed this as a judge? You mentioned, so I do want to mention that the three independent journalists who were involved in the DHS case, there was Sean Beckner, Carr Mitchell, Ryan Mina, and Lexus Olivier Ray of LA Taco, just because some of their work has been out there and people might have seen it as they covered these protests. And so I'm just acknowledging their independent work. And then the decision. So this is issued. There's an injunction. What what is being constrained now by this decision?
Yeah. So first on the journalists, it also took an army of pro bono lawyers on this, and then journalists to bear witness and to provide their declarations, to be witnesses to the court, and to provide evidence of that. So Sean, Ryan, and Lex were all fantastic, and indeed are plaintiffs as well. These cases have different plaintiffs, so that they're on, I believe, on the federal one. You've also got Status Quo and Tina Desiree Berg on the LAPD one and the LASD one. The LASD one also has the Southlander, which is a new startup, and Ben Camacho has been central to that on the sheriff's department case. So a
Yeah.
lot of really great local journalists, and those individuals again range from freelancers to LA Taco, which is a great, I don't even want to call it a startup. It's been around for years now. They do great work here in town. A lot of cultural, as you might imagine from the name, a lot of restaurant reviews, but also a lot of hard news. And then Ryan is with the LA Daily News, which is one of the most established, largest daily newspapers in town. And a part of a network. Her work is seen all over the region through different newspapers. So, really, good resumes across the board there, and serious journalists all. So in terms of now, what do we actually get out of these injunctions? So, part of the issue that we've always been concerned about is just paper wins. And when we got this law passed in California, it's called Penal Code 409.7. Some people may know it as Senate Bill 98 because that was the big fight in 2021 to get that passed. And it says, as I mentioned before, police cannot interfere with arrests, or even really detain journalists, during unlawful assemblies. So the judges look this over, and there's different provisions for these different cases. Different, like as I mentioned, DHS can also apply to protesters, but he's not going to apply necessarily all the same provisions that might necessarily apply to press, like remaining after a dispersal order. So it clarifies on the DHS one things like press may remain and they cannot be chased away when there's a dispersal order. They need sight and sound access. I don't think he used that exact term, but that's sort of the way I would interpret it. It has a number of things like that. And then again, with things for protesters, it's, when there's a dispersal order and they're going to use potentially less lethal munitions, which is a very euphemistic term, they're required to give audible dispersal orders, which is something we know has always been an issue, is whether they're audible. And it makes it clear that they're not allowed to indiscriminately attack people in the crowds just because there's one or two people in a small minority who can be individually targeted and arrested. So part of these injunctions require that within 72 hours, and so by the time people hear this, that time will have passed. The DHS is required to notify all personnel in the Central District of California, and that is a geography where we see many of these ICE raids. Includes Los Angeles County and about 7 or so neighboring counties. And so they're required to notify personnel of all of these requirements, where frankly, you've got this culture where they think they can just go out and crack skulls. And so now they're being told by the commanding officers, okay, these are the rules we have to abide by. If they violate those rules, there's the potential of being held in contempt, being dragged in front of the judge, different consequences, which I think lawyers would be better able to speak to. And the idea here is also to include better definitions for them around who is a journalist. And there's been a lot of debates over that, and we probably don't have time today to get into all the nuance of that. But he basically took an existing decision from the Ninth Circuit in the Index Newspapers case that was out of Portland a few years back and applied it, which is really helpful here because sometimes police will say, well, you have to have a credential issued by police. No, the government doesn't get to decide who's press and not. That's a terrible idea. So it can be things like having large professional cameras, business cards. I don't know if you mentioned business cards. I know that's one that's been used in the past. Professional indicia on your body, IDs issued by employers, any number of things, but they use the term indicia or indicum, which is a great way of thinking about it, that we're not just saying it's only certified people, it's people who are out there with what I would call a premeditated intent to commit journalism. Right? And if you can demonstrate that through something, you should be allowed to remain and you should be exempt. So it applies these rules to DHS and all those subsidiary agencies, and it requires them to disseminate that. And it means that if a journalist is in the field at that time and they're having an issue, they can cite this. They can then ask for a supervisor and say, hey, here's this order from a judge saying I get to be here. Now, we've seen that officers break the law, right? So we're not naive about this. If that is violated, it gives them any number of grounds for legal recourse. It shows that the officers in the department, the agency, knew that they were breaking the law when they broke it, which right now, maybe they could argue there's been some gray area. Gray area is gone. We fixed that. So, again, you're never going to win an argument with a gun, but, so I don't encourage people to put themselves in life-altering jeopardy, but it means they can push back. That's the DHS case. The LAPD case, I'll say, adds some really good additional provisions, which we hope will lead to change in culture. In addition to pushing more requirements about how often the officers are trained, there's annual updates on these crowd control policies and the requirements of the preliminary injunction the judge set out, and similar sorts of provisions to protect journalists, like I mentioned with DHS. It also requires that every 12 months, LAPD officers have to acknowledge receipt of those provisions. If they do not, they are not allowed to go out to protests. So let's say that's violated. Okay, well, now command staff can be held accountable by the judge. They can be sanctioned. Now, let's say an officer does sign and say, okay, I received this every 12 months. So they knew. We now have an audit trail to go to with, say, internal affairs, which is also called Professional Standards Bureau. And what we've struggled with for years here is that the officers knew they were above the law. They knew they couldn't be disciplined because who could prove that they thought that could be the law? Like, this seems something that's not part of the normal penal code. Okay, now they're literally signing their name on the dotted line each year. That's the hope in the implementation here. When they get pulled in front of internal affairs, now they can face discipline. I think now it actually gives them the grounds which they didn't have before. And we can't forget how strongly the police unions still control things in a very problematic way and create this world of impunity for these officers. So I don't think it's going to remediate things that have happened very well from the past, but I do think that it puts them on notice that, hey, wait a minute, I thought I had qualified immunity and I could just crack skulls. Oh, wait, now I might lose my job. I might lose my overtime. I might lose any number of things that are important to an officer. And, I will see when rubber hits road here. We don't know until it happens. But that is my hope, is that through that discipline and through that training, we start to actually change that culture of 25 years.
That all sounds good. And thanks for mentioning all those other reporters. I'm aware of them as well, but yeah, I was only giving the federal case,
Oh, it's so
and it's
many. Yeah.
important. And it's important for people to have the names of the ones that were on the other one. So I'm glad you had those handy. Thank you for sharing your wealth of knowledge about Los Angeles and what's been going on with press freedom. As we look nationally, well, I actually have two questions for you, just because you are LA based. I have one slightly unrelated question that I want to throw at you, just because I feel like it affects everything. But to wind down this ICE conversation here, we see, as you're saying, the expansion into other cities. And I think probably for the feds, they're looking at LA as a kind of model of what they could replicate in different other jurisdictions, because they have been able to be there for what, several months now, right?
Yeah, it's over 3 months at this point. Started in early June.
Yeah, so I'm based just outside of Chicago, on the city limits, and so I've been following the move into the Chicagoland, and it's really not reasonable to talk about this. And I think you might have run into some of this with LA too, of like, it's not just city of LA proper where they are going in and conducting operations. We're talking like an entire county that they're involved in taking actions, right? So, like you said, Los Angeles County is this like whole entire massive area that you could see operations. But uh, what I was going to get to is they sort of set a time limit of like we might be gone in a month, but they don't necessarily have to be gone in a month. But I think it's sort of dependent on where things go. And for various cities that are wondering what to do as ICE and these other authorities collaborate with ICE. I mean, here in Illinois, in particular, I'll just use this as an example. They're actually, it's against the law for them to help ICE in any way. I don't know if that had any bearing on anything that you've experienced or anything you've talked to journalists about that had their rights violated. But what we're finding is that, and when I was following LA, what it seemed like was these police will stand back and facilitate a space around ICE so that they can still do what they're doing. So they're not involved in the deportations, but then they are involved in the clearing of journalists, the clearing away of protesters for the benefit of these federal government agencies. And that's what I think we will see in Chicago or Boston or Nashville or New Orleans or wherever else they move into. So that's a long kind of twisty turny way of getting to my question, which is, what have you learned while on the ground that you think journalists maybe need to take with them, or have top of mind as they're out there in the field and they're trying to protect themselves and preserve their rights?
First thing I would point out from that is that there's police theory and police practice, and these are two different things. Police theory is that there's a government action and a need for the government to do its job, and they can facilitate that. So whether that's federal agents protecting federal agents, or whether that's local agents protecting federal agents in their ability to do what they consider their work. Um, that's their theory, is that they are trying to facilitate that and protect that, even if it is a like what they would call a sanctuary city, or there's rules, and like here in Los Angeles, they're not the law enforcement's not supposed to help ICE, but that's not supposed to help ICE to arrest immigrants, right? That doesn't mean that they can't protect ICE from protesters. And by protect, I mean, like, there's not really much to protect, but I mean, these are armed people, with not just with arms, but like shields and body armor and stuff like that.
And
Um,
masks and stuff that,
yeah,
like, you can't
yeah.
identify them.
Exactly. So, but if it's like, let's say the road is blocked a few blocks away, yeah, it's the local police that are supposed to, in theory, clear out that road, and so allow the federal vehicles to travel on the local roads. So, ostensibly, that's why local police get called in, and that doesn't mean that they're actually putting the handcuffs on an immigrant, chasing them down, doing the investigation, processing paperwork. It means they're keeping the streets open and the normal flow of traffic, and that's actually part of their job. That's the theory. The practice that we have seen in Los Angeles, and I've heard I haven't seen this reported out, but I've actually heard reporters mention it, that the chief of police here has said, well, we have a solemn duty to respond to an officer in need. So what we've seen happen is that the federal agents will essentially bait everyone who's a protester. There'll be a handful of protesters who do something inappropriate. Maybe one will throw a water bottle. I've never seen anyone reload a water bottle, right? It's not like this is going to keep happening over and over. But there's definitely problematic things, and those people should be arrested for endangering people. That's not cool. But I don't think the kinds of things they typically throw are going to do much damage to someone in level 3A body armor and ballistic helmets. I mean, it's just it's obnoxious. I'm not condoning it, but I'm also saying it's a little overstated usually. Now, when that happens, they call and they radio to LAPD with a 25-year history of violence against protesters, of rioting in their own streets, of cracking skulls, seemingly just with impunity and for fun, for lack of a better term, because it doesn't seem like they're accomplishing anything work-wise. So they call in the more violent force, which is in the less controlled force, right? Traditionally, federal officers, I think, are better trained, and they just go, "Hey, have fun." And that's not what they're saying in words, but it's what they're saying in implication. And so that officer needs help call is often grossly misleading. So that's the dynamic, the practice that people need to be aware of. Next thing I'll mention on the rights is that local laws are going to vary, and your local laws will not apply to federal agents. So it's one thing if you do have a shield law, for example, in Illinois or in Kentucky or wherever else, and if you've got that, great, but that's not going to apply with the feds. Be very concerned about your devices. If you do happen to be arrested, do you have biometrics on? Because we've known cops to wave devices in front of journalists' faces to try and open them and then scan their devices, which violates all sorts of laws, but they act above the law. So you need to think about your operational security well in advance. You need to think about your physical security and your safety and your risk factors. So there's a whole lot to go into with PPE and things like that, which are not right for this conversation, but journalists going out there will be in over their head way too quickly if they haven't spent many, many hours not only reading up on this, but then practicing with gear, making sure it fits, making sure it's appropriate for the conditions. You need real training on this. And then the other thing, maybe to get into here is the dynamic that I mentioned before, like the economy of the journalism industry and the implications here. One of the things that may stand out to people who really dive into the evidence from these cases is that while we do have, mentions to everyone from CNN and Fox to, and New York Times in some of these cases, the people who are mostly cooperating with the investigations are the freelance and independent journalists, those from smaller nonprofit newsrooms. It's not across the board. I'm not saying it's universal, but that's the trend. And the reason that they're willing to participate is that, they are not in a corporate entity telling them to put a sock in it. And I am in touch with a lot of major corporate media lawyers who representing these very large major newsrooms, and I'm in touch with their staff. And so I am very keenly aware, even if it's sort of a wink wink situation, as it often is, but sometimes very explicitly, people will tell me, our lawyers told me I can't talk about this. The management said, do not pursue this. We will take you off of your beat and not allow you to work. There have been threats beyond that, which I won't speak to right now, but that people have come to me with who are working in these, really some of the few prime media jobs, right, that are out there right now. And they're afraid of losing their jobs because management doesn't want them to be a part of the story, or because legal doesn't want to get involved. They don't want to be targeted, by the Trump administration for the types of settlements that we've seen in some of these private cases, civil cases.
Mhm.
And so the dynamic has gotten kind of ugly where it's much worse than everything I've described. The reality is that more journalists would come out if they could and have wanted to even file lawsuits of their own and been dissuaded from doing so. So, what that means is that journalists need to have if let's say you work for a major corporate newsroom and you run into one of these situations, you're free to talk to another lawyer. But there's a lot of press rights groups out there that provide pro bono legal support. Talk to another lawyer. Don't just trust the lawyer of your station because they represent the station or the newspaper. They don't represent you in all ways. So
Mhm.
you can get your own counsel on that independently, and you don't even need to tell them. The other huge thing are the labor unions out there, and there's some that have been very proactive in this, and some that have not. So it's a big range. So like one of our co-plaintiffs is the News Guild, and that's wonderful. There are other unions that have just not gotten involved yet, that maybe have other issues distracting them or different interests, but they need to protect their employees right now against management, which is telling journalists in many cases, stick a sock in it. And when they do that, they're not able to do their job. And the whole point of journalism is lost at that point. We cannot inform the public of what's really going on. And I would say, for a journalist ethics perspective, as a final note on this, is that normally it's the right thing to not be part of the story in journalism, but when you cannot tell the story, you are the story. And that is the clear exception to those rules about not being a part of it. you are a part of it. You cannot, there's no such thing as a view from nowhere. That's a fabrication,
Yeah.
and so journalist ethics preaches transparency. It preaches openness. It doesn't, it does preach like try not to be don't put yourself in the center of the story. But if you cannot tell the story, there's no journalistic ethics that I really know of that's been thought through that says, oh, you can't pursue your legal rights in this situation. So those are important conversations that need to be had at the local level, not just with your newsroom and with your colleagues, but also with your union and other journalist associations that may be near you.
I would say, as a journalist myself, that while I may not want to be the focus, if I'm under some kind of an attack, I almost have an obligation, in fact, maybe a responsibility to fight back, because if I don't, then it's going to weaken the First Amendment for everyone who is, in my vicinity, who, like could end up being collateral damage if I don't do something to fight back. At least that's my opinion. And I'm really glad that you ended up going where I wanted to finish up our conversation by mentioning the dynamics that are coming as a result of who is in the White House, as a result of the administration that has deployed ICE to our American streets. And I just want to throw a few things at you, and just say that, in my view, this probably makes it even more of a traumatic or stress-filled environment for reporters. So what you were getting at, with the police going out there to provide and respond to ICE, I've heard from, in particular, Tina Desiree Berg told me that it was her belief that what was more contentious and more risky for journalists was not the ICE protests, but actually, like, when they heard of ICE operations and they went to go cover those and report on them, that was when they were seeing the most danger for journalists. But in particular, since we have talked about mostly like all of that, we have seen the administration go after ICE reporting in general. Like we've seen, I saw you reacting to this. We've seen government lawyers arguing that just the act of filming ICE is violence. We've seen immigrant journalists or non-citizen journalists being uh, detained or threatened with detention, or feeling that their entire rights are chilled as a result of the actions of this administration. So just maybe get to that, because, and also throw in the Ice Block app, which you might be familiar with, that was this really tiny little thing that only a few thousand people were using. I don't know how much bigger it got, but when CNN made the decision to do coverage and report on it, they basically got threatened by the White House with a lawsuit. And so, this idea of reporters covering where ICE raids are happening in the neighborhood, it's being treated as if journalists are like an accomplice to criminals and helping violent people evade ICE. And I think it's a tremendous problem and has added to the chilling environment.
Yeah, I want to hit that very hard in saying that those arguments, it's not that we're saying we have a counter argument or they're spurious no, it's un-American, it's unpatriotic, and it is a betrayal of this country if that's the position that they want to take. Because the reason we exist as a country is that we have a First Amendment that allows the public to be informed. And so it is, again, unpatriotic and un-American to take that point of view. And if you don't like it, leave, get out of this country. And I say that to with all sincerity, that this is not the place for you. You can go to some weird authoritarian third world country, because that's the term that they would use for it. But you don't belong in America if that's the way you feel. This is the most foundational American principle and value. And so if you can't deal with that, go. Like, I don't want you here. You clearly don't want to be here. So bye. Now, if you want to start from an earnest position and say, hey, you know what? The public deserves to know what's going on in the world, and law enforcement has a job to do, whether or not you agree with any policies or not. Because like I could argue those things. That's not what I'm here to do. Um, Look, none of this so-called violence that's caused by filming. First of all, the Supreme Court, Jesus, has already ruled on this. I mean, it's just so clear. But the argument that was made in court, I sat there watching this DOJ lawyer for DHS making the argument that, well, it is doxing and inciting violence. It's not. Like, show me where the press has done that. They haven't. To the contrary, they've filmed things like the murder of George Floyd and proven, is a person who wasn't even a journalist but won an honorary Pulitzer for doing that. They've shown what's actually happening in our streets, and the lawyer kind of made our case for us, because then he went up there in front of the same judge in the same hearing in the same courtroom and said, "Hey, you know what? You need to be careful, Your Honor, about this, because they have declarations saying that that CBP pointed guns at press at MacArthur Park." And the journalists were literally sitting in the room who had had guns pointed at them. And he said, "But we have a declaration saying that there were no firearms pointed at journalists from one of our officers." I mean, people were flabbergasted, because, like, well, not only do we have the people who can say that, it's on video. The reason we knew that is it's on video. So he just made the point of why we need to have video to prove what happened, because this government lawyer stood in front of the judge, and maybe he was mistaken and he thought, oh, it was a senior officer who was doing a recounting, and maybe had said, like, oh, we didn't discharge any firearms. But the words that came out of his mouth, that lawyer in that courtroom, was that they had evidence, a declaration that countered our declarations of people saying that they'd had guns pointed at them. Go to the video. And the only way we can prove what happened is because journalists videotaped it. So this is vital for the functioning of democracy. It shows when the government lies in court, as happened, right? And so whether that's, I don't want to create any legal implications about what what is a lie from a judge's standard, but what I mean is the government can try to lie or mislead the judge. And the judge took a very long time, very carefully went through the evidence, and made a very stern ruling, in some cases saying there wasn't a shred of evidence in some of the defense's claims. And there was this mountain of evidence from our side. So it is fundamentally necessary to document what happens in the world. And you go back, there wasn't video in the 1780s, and when the First Amendment was crafted, but there was a free press. There were people who could bear witness. There were people who could write things down and publish them, and to share that, whether it was on pamphlets, whether it was Thomas Paine, whether it was Ben Franklin as a larger newspaper publisher, and Thomas Jefferson, who said, were it left to me to choose between, government and newspapers, or without newspapers, or newspapers without a government, I wouldn't hesitate a moment to choose the latter, meaning he'd rather have the press than a government. And he also had a very important part, because journalists love to quote that, by the way. He had one other line that's really great that follows that, and I'm going to paraphrase it here. He said, "But what I should mean by that is that the people should receive the newspapers and know how to read them." So it was important that people be educated, have media literacy, and to receive that information. So we're talking about, like, all the founders of this country were really super clear that this was like priority one, was to make sure that the people could be informed and do their job. So that's why I bring it back to that forceful side, to say, well, it's not like a two sides either or, and that they have a point. Look, yeah, if someone is using tools of the press to incite violence, okay, I do have a problem with that, right? I'm not condoning that. But I'm saying that these are, empty lies in many cases, and that it is outright un-American to make that argument. And we cannot normalize that. We cannot let that slip into public discourse unchallenged. We have to forcefully push back and say, no, that has no place in this country. And if that's really how you feel, don't change this country, just leave it.
So as we conclude here, is there anything you wanted to leave people with? I don't know. You're at the Los Angeles Press Club. I have no idea if there's anything you want to ask people to support, or if you want to direct people anywhere. But this is typically when I would have my guests do that.
Support your local journalists. Think about your media diet, where you get news from. Think about how it could be better. I guarantee you have public media near you right now, wherever you are in this country, and I guarantee you they're hurting. And so, whether it's a membership, whether it's any other kind of support, that's a great way you can contribute. Everywhere you go, there are press orgs, nonprofits, whether it's large national ones, Freedom of the Press Foundation, Committee to Protect Journalists, Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press, whether it's your local ones like press clubs or SPJ, Society of Professional Journalists chapters, ethnic media orgs, National Association of Black Journalists, Asian American Journalists Association, National Association of Hispanic Journalists. So many wonderful media rights organizations, media organizations themselves. support them. I'm not going to ask someone in Florida to give money to the LA Press Club. If you want to, you're welcome to. But start local. It all depends on that. And we are a decentralized, diverse information ecosystem, and we need to support all of that.
All right, Adam. Thank you.
Been a pleasure.